Page 35. Better Never to Have Been, by David Benatar, 2006. Chapter 2. Why Coming into Existence is Always a Harm. 2.3. Lives Worth Starting and Lives Worth Continuing. The expression "a life worth living" is ambiguous between "a life worth continuing", let us call this the present life sense, and "a life worth starting", let us call this the future life sense. A life worth continuing, like a life not worth continuing, are judgments one can make about an already existent person. A life worth starting, like a life not worth starting, are judgments one can make about a potential but non-existent being. Now the problem is that a number of people have employed the present life sense and applied it to future life cases, which are quite different. When they distinguish between impairments that make a life not worth living and impairments that, though severe, are not so bad as to make life not worth living, they are making the judgments in the present life cases. Those lives not worth living are those that would not be worth continuing. Similarly, those lives worth living are those that are worth continuing. But the problem is that these notions are then applied to future life cases. In this way, we are led to make judgments about future life cases by the standards of present life cases. However, quite different standards apply in the two kinds of case. The judgment that an impairment is so bad that it makes life not worth continuing is usually made at a much higher threshold than the judgment that an impairment is sufficiently bad to make life not worth beginning. That is to say, if a life is not worth continuing, a fortiori yet is not worth beginning. It does not follow, however, that if a life is worth continuing it is worth beginning, or that if it is not worth beginning it would not be worth continuing. For instance, while most people think that living life without a limb does not make life so bad that it is worth ending, most, of the same, people also think that it is better not to bring into existence somebody who will lack a limb. We require stronger justification for ending a life than for not starting one. We are now in a position to understand how it might be preferable not to begin a life worth living. The paradoxical appearance of such a view rests on understanding a life worth living in the future life sense. Clearly, it would be odd to claim that it is preferable not to start a life that is worth starting. However, the future life sense is not the relevant sense in this context, because we are considering the contrast to a life not worth continuing, and namely a life worth continuing. There is nothing paradoxical about the claim that it is preferable not to begin a life that would be worth continuing. My argument so far rests on the view that there is a morally important distinction between future life and present life cases. There are some lines of argument that threaten to diminish the importance of this distinction and thus weaken my case. I wish to reply to each. First, I consider an argument of Derek Parfit's. He suggests that if I am benefited by having my life saved just after it started, even if at the expense of acquiring some severe but non-catastrophic impairment, then it is not implausible to claim that I am benefited by having my life started, with such an impairment. This argument seeks to minimize the significance of the distinction between future life and present life cases. On this view, it is not unreasonable to think that impairments that are inflicted in the course of saving a life are morally comparable to similar impairments that are inseparable from bringing a life into existence. One objection to this argument is that it rests on a shaky premise, namely, that one is benefited by having one's life saved just after it is started, if that entails one's having a severe, even though non-catastrophic, defect for the rest of one's life. Although at first sight this premise may seem firm and widely accepted, a little probing reveals its weakness. The problem is that it is implicitly assumed that there is some point, even if approximate, at which a being comes into existence in a morally relevant sense, that is, in the sense of having an interest deserving of moral consideration. However, as the extensive literature about abortion suggests, coming into existence in the morally relevant sense is more like a very extended process than an event. I was once a fertilized ovum. Arguably my conception was the time that I came into existence in a strictly ontological sense. But it is much less clear that this was also the moment that I came into existence in a morally relevant sense. Although most people would agree that to save my life now at the cost of my leg would confer a net benefit on me, many fewer people would think that saving the life of a conceptus at the cost of its living a life without a leg constitutes a net benefit. That is why many more people support therapeutic abortions even for non-catastrophic defects than condemn life-saving amputations on ordinary adults. Some people support even infanticide or at least passive euthanasia for neonates with severe but non-catastrophic disabilities even though they would not judge similar conduct to be in the interests of non-infant children and adults with such defects. Those who exist, in the morally relevant sense, have interests in existing. These interests, once fully developed, are typically very strong and thus, where there is a conflict, they override interests in not being impaired. However, where there are no, or very weak, interests in existing, causing impairments, by bringing people with defects into being, cannot be warranted by the protection of such interests. The scope of a class of beings without interests, or with very weak interests, in existing is a matter of dispute. Does it include embryos, zygotes, infants? In Chapter 5 I argue that at least zygotes, embryos, and fetuses until quite late in gestation have not begun existing in a morally relevant sense and that coming to exist in a morally relevant sense is a gradual process. These reflections undermine the notion that there is any such stage as a just after one comes into existence, in the morally relevant sense of a comes into existence. If we view coming into existence, in the morally relevant sense, as the extended process that it is, then we are likely to permit greater life-saving sacrifices as a being's interest in existing develops. The neat contrast between starting a life and saving a life just after it is started falls away. It accordingly becomes much less plausible to make an inference from the case of saving a life after it has started to the case of starting a life, as they seem to be much farther apart. Now some might think that the gradualist view about coming into existence undermines my distinction between future life cases and present life cases. This, however, is not true. That the distinction between them is a gradual one does not render the distinction void. Nothing I have said excludes the possibility of a middle ground linking the two kinds of cases. Nor is the moral significance of the distinction compromised so long as one does not, as I do not, reject a moral sensitivity to the gradualism of the continuum that links clear future life cases with clear present life cases. The next possible threat to the distinction between present life cases and future life cases comes from a line of reasoning advanced by Joel Feinberg. He suggests, as I indicated earlier, that we understand the claim that somebody would have been better off not coming into existence as the assertion that that being's never existing would have been preferable. This assertion, he claims correctly, is not plagued by any logical difficulties. However, he goes on to advance an account of when it is preferable not to come into being, such that, in almost all cases, never existing cannot be said to be preferable. He distinguishes between judgments by competent adults or mature older children that it would have been preferable if they had never come into existence, and similar judgments made by proxies on behalf of those who are so extremely impaired that they cannot make judgments themselves. In the case of the extremely impaired, he thinks, it is insufficient that the judgment of the preferability of never existing be consistent with reason. It must be dictated, or required, by reason. He thinks that this requirement is met for very few disabling conditions, those where death is preferable. In the case of competent beings making the judgment that their never existing would have been preferable, he allows that it be merely consistent with reason, that is, not irrational. Although it is much easier for a judgment to satisfy the requirement that it be consistent with reason, it is a fact of human psychology that very rarely do people, even those enduring considerable hardships, prefer not to have existed. The result is that on Professor Feinberg's view, most beings who are brought into existence with disabilities which, although not so bad as to make life worth ending, are nonetheless severe, cannot be said to be harmed. One can only be harmed if it would have been preferable that one did not come into existence, and on his interpretation of this requirement it is met only very rarely. The reason why this account conflicts with my distinction between present life cases and future life cases is that implicit in it is the requirement that we make judgments about future life cases through the lens of present life cases. Either life has to be so bad that it would not be worth continuing, a Professor Feinberg's standard for proxy decisions, or it has to be the case that already existing people with that disability would prefer never to have come into existence, his standard for those whose disabilities do not impair their competence to decide, retrospectively, for themselves. However, it is precisely because Professor Feinberg's account requires us to adopt the perspective of already existing people that it is inadequate. In asking whether life is worth starting, we should not have to consider whether it would not be worth continuing. Nor should we have to appeal to the preferences of already existing people about their own lives to make judgments about future lives. As I shall show in the second section of the next chapter, self-assessments of one's life's quality are unreliable. Although I reject Professor Feinberg's account of when it is preferable not to come into existence, I agree that we can understand the notion of harming somebody by bringing him into existence, in terms of the preferability of either existing or never existing. That is to say, one harms somebody by bringing him into existence if his existence is such that never existing would have been preferable. Similarly, a person is not harmed by being brought into existence if his existence is such that it is preferable to never existing. The question to which we must now turn, then, is when is never existing preferable? Put another way, when does coming into existence harm? Alternatively, we can ask, when is coming into existence bad while never coming into existence not bad? The answer, I shall now argue, is always. Page 41.